The Nose by Ryunosuke Akutagawa 1916. You just had to mention Zenkai Negu's nose, and everyone in Ikuno knew what you were talking about. Never mind that his name ascribed to him the wisdom of Zen, Zenkai, or that he was one of only 10 priests honored to minister within, Negu, the imperial palace in Kyoto. All that mattered was that nose of his. Uniform in thickness from base to tip, it hung a full 6 inches from above his upper lip to below his chin, like a sausage dangling down from the middle of his face. The nose had been a constant source of torment for the Negu from his earliest days as a young acolyte until now, past the age of 50, when he had reached his present lofty post. On the surface, of course, he pretended it did not bother him, and not only because he felt it wrong for a priest to worry over his nose when he should be thirsting exclusively for the Pure Land to come. What he hated most of all was for other people to become aware of his concern over his nose. And what he feared most of all was that the word nose would come up in conversation. There were 2 reasons why his nose was more than the Negu could manage. One was that it actually got in his way much of the time. He could not eat by himself. Whenever he tried to, the tip of his nose would touch the rice in his metal bowl. To deal with this problem, he had a disciple sit across from him at mealtime and hold his nose up with a long, narrow wooden slat, 1 inch wide and 2 feet long. This was not an easy thing to do either for the slat-wielding disciple or for the Negu himself. A temple page who stood in for the disciple at one meal sneezed and let the nose drop into the rice gruel. The story immediately spread across the river to Kyoto. Still, this was not the main reason the Negu was troubled by his nose. He suffered most because of the harm it was doing to his self-esteem. The people of Ikuno used to say that Zenkai Negu was lucky to be a priest. No woman would ever want to marry a man with a nose like that. Some even claimed it was because of his nose that he had entered the priesthood to begin with. The Negu himself, however, never felt that he suffered any less over his nose for being a priest. Indeed, his self-esteem was already far too fragile to be affected by such a secondary fact as whether or not he had a wife. And so, by means both active and passive, he sought to repair the damage to his self-esteem. He tried first of all to find ways to make his nose look shorter. When there was no one around, he would hold up his mirror and, with feverish intensity, examine his reflection from every angle. Sometimes it took more than simply changing the position of his face to comfort him, and he would try one pose after another, resting his cheek on his hand or stroking his chin with his fingertips. Never once, though, was he satisfied that his nose looked any shorter. In fact, he sometimes felt that the harder he tried, the longer it looked. Then, heaving fresh sighs of despair, he would put the mirror away in its box and drag himself back to the scripture stand to resume chanting the Canon Sutra. 1. The second way he dealt with his problem was to keep a vigilant eye out for other people's noses. Many public events took place at the Ikuno temple, banquets to benefit the priests, lectures on the sutras, and so forth. Row upon row of monks' cells filled the temple grounds, and each day the monks would heat up bath water for the temple's many residents and lay visitors, all of whom the Negu would study closely. He hoped to gain peace from discovering even one face with a nose like his. And so his eyes took in neither blue robes nor white, orange caps, skirts of grey. The priestly garb he knew so well hardly existed for him. The Negu saw not people but noses. While a great hooked beak might come into his view now and then, never did he discover a nose like his own. And with each failure to find what he was looking for, the Negu's resentment would increase. It was entirely due to this feeling that often, while speaking to a person, he would unconsciously grasp the dangling end of his nose and blush like a youngster. And finally, the Negu would comb the Buddhist scriptures and other classic texts, searching for a character with a nose like his own in the hope that it would provide him some measure of comfort. Nowhere, however, was it written that the nose of either Mokurin or Shirihatsu was long. And Ryu and Memio, of course, were bodhisattvas with normal human noses. Listening to a Chinese story once, he heard that Liu Bei, the Shu Han emperor too, had long ears. Oh, if only it had been his nose, he thought, how much better I would feel. We need hardly mention here that, Even as he pursued these passive efforts, the Negu also took more active steps to shorten his nose. He tried everything. He drank a decoction of boiled snake gourd, he rubbed his nose with rat urine. Nothing did any good, however, the nose continued to dangle 6 inches down over his lips. One autumn, however, a disciple of his who had gone to Kyoto in part on an errand for the Negu himself came back to Iknoo with a new method for shortening noses that he had learned from a doctor friend. This doctor was a man from China who had become a high-ranking priest at a major Kyoto temple, the Krokuji. Pretending, as usual, that he was unconcerned about his nose, the Negu would not at first agree to submit to the new treatment. Instead, at mealtimes he would offer a casual expression of regret that the disciple had gone to so much trouble. Inwardly, of course, he was hoping that the disciple would press him to try the treatment. And the disciple must have been aware of the Negu's tactics. But his master's very willingness to employ such tactics seemed to rouse the aide to sympathy more than resentment. Just as the Negu had hoped, the disciple used every argument he could think of to persuade his master to adopt the treatment. And, as he knew he would, the Negu finally submitted to the disciple's fervent exhortations. The treatment itself was actually quite simple: boil the nose and have someone tread on it. Boiling water could be had any day at the temple bathhouse. The disciple immediately brought a bucket full of water that was too hot for him to touch. If the Negu simply dipped his nose straight into the bucket, however, his face might be scalded by the rising steam. So they bored a hole in a tray, set the tray on the bucket, and lowered the nose through the hole into the boiling water. The nose itself felt no heat at all. After the nose had been soaking for a short while, the disciple said, "I believe it has cooked long enough, Your Reverence." The Negu gave him a contorted smile. At least, he thought with some satisfaction, no one overhearing this one remark would imagine that the subject was a nose. The boiled nose itself, however, was itching now as if it had been bitten by fleas. The Negu withdrew his nose from the hole in the tray, and the disciple began to tread on the still steaming thing with all his might. The Negu lay with his nose stretched out on the floorboards, watching the disciple's feet moving up and down before his eyes. Every now and then, the disciple would cast a pitying glance down toward the Negu's bald head and say, "Does it hurt, Your Reverence? The doctor told me to stamp on it as hard as I could, but, does it hurt?" The Negu tried to shake his head to signal that it did not hurt, but with the disciple's feet pressing down on his nose, he was unable to do so. Instead, he turned his eyes upward until he could see the raw cracks in the disciple's chapped feet and gave an angry-sounding shout, "No, it doesn't hurt." Far from hurting, his itchy nose almost felt good to have the young man treading on it. After this had been going on for some time, little bumps like millet grains began to form on the nose until it looked like a bird that had been plucked clean and roasted whole. When he saw this, the disciple stopped his treading and muttered as if to himself, "Now I'm supposed to pull those out with tweezers." The Negu puffed out his cheeks in apparent exasperation as he silently watched the disciple proceed with the treatment. Not that he was ungrateful for the efforts. But as much as he appreciated the young man's kindness, he did not like having his nose handled like some kind of thing. The Negu watched in apprehension, like a patient being operated on by a doctor he mistrusts, as the disciple plucked beads of fat from the pores of his nose with the tweezers. The beads protruded half an inch from each pore like stumps of feathers. Once he was through, the disciple said with a look of relief, "Now we just have to cook it again." Brows knit in apparent disapproval, the Negu did as he was told. After the second boiling, the nose looked far shorter than it ever had before. Indeed, it was not much different from an ordinary hooked nose. Stroking his newly shortened nose, the Negu darted a few timid glances into the mirror the young man held out to him. The nose which once had dangled down below his chin now had shrunk to such an unbelievable degree that it seemed only to be hanging on above his upper lip by a feeble last breath. The red blotches that marked it were probably left from the trampling. No one would laugh at this nose anymore. The face of the Negu inside the mirror looked at the face of the Negu outside the mirror, eyelids fluttering in satisfaction. Still, he felt uneasy for the rest of that day lest his nose grow long again. Whether intoning scriptures or taking his meals, he would unobtrusively reach up at every opportunity and touch his nose. Each time, he would find it exactly where it belonged, above his upper lip, with no sign that it intended to let itself down any lower. Then came a night of sleep, and the first thing he did upon waking the next day was to feel his nose again. It was still short. Only then did the Negu begin to enjoy the kind of relief he had experienced once before, years ago, when he had accumulated religious merit for having copied out the entire Lotus Sutra by hand. Not 3 full days had passed, however, before the Negu made a surprising discovery. First, a certain samurai with business at the Ike-no-o temple seemed even more amused than before when, barely speaking to the Negu, he stared hard at the nose. Then the page who had dropped his nose into the gruel passed him outside the lecture hall. The boy first looked down as he tried to keep his laughter in check, but finally, unable to control himself, he let it burst out. And finally, on more than one occasion, a subordinate priest who remained perfectly respectful while taking orders from the Negu face-to-face would start giggling as soon as the Negu had turned away. At first the Negu ascribed this behavior to the change in his appearance. But that alone did not seem to explain it sufficiently. True, this may have been what caused the laughter of the page and the subordinate. But the way they were laughing now was somehow different from the way they had laughed before, when his nose was long. Perhaps it was simply that they found the unfamiliar short nose funnier than the familiar long one. But there seemed to be more to it than that. They never laughed so openly before. Our dear Negu would sometimes break off intoning the scriptures and mutter this sort of thing to himself, tilting his bald head to one side. His eyes would wander up to the portrait of the Bodhisattva Fugn3 hanging beside him. And he would sink into gloom, thinking about how it had been for him a few days earlier, when he still had his long nose, just as he who can now sink no lower fondly recalls his days of glory. The Negu, unfortunately, lacked the wisdom to find a solution to this problem. The human heart harbors 2 conflicting sentiments. Everyone of course sympathizes with people who suffer misfortunes. Yet when those people manage to overcome their misfortunes, we feel a certain disappointment. We may even feel, to overstate the case somewhat, a desire to plunge them back into those misfortunes. And before we know it, we come, if only passively, to harbor some degree of hostility toward them. It was precisely because he sensed this kind of spectator's egoism in both the lay and the priestly communities of Ike-no-o that the Negu, while unaware of the reason, felt an indefinable malaise. And so the Negu's mood worsened with each passing day. He could hardly say a word to people without snapping at them until finally, even the disciple who had performed the treatment on his nose began to whisper behind his back, "The Negu will be punished for treating us so harshly instead of teaching us Buddha's law." The one who made the Negu especially angry was that mischievous page. One day the Negu heard some loud barking, and without giving it much thought, he stepped outside to see what was going on. There, he found the page waving a long stick in pursuit of a scrawny long-haired dog. The boy was not simply chasing after the dog, however. He was also shouting as if for the dog, "Can't hit my nose! Ha ha! Can't hit my nose!" The Negu ripped the stick from the boy's hand and smacked him in the face with it. Then he realized this stick was the slat they had used to hold his nose up at mealtimes. His nose had been shortened all right, thought the Negu, but he hated what it was doing to him. And then one night something happened. The wind must have risen quite suddenly after the sun went down, to judge by the annoying jangle of the pagoda wind chimes that reached him at his pillow. The air was much colder as well, and the aging Negu was finding it impossible to sleep. Eyes wide open in the darkness, he became aware of a new itching sensation in his nose. He reached up and found the nose slightly swollen to the touch. It, and only it, seemed to be feverish as well. "We took such drastic steps to shorten it, maybe that gave me some kind of illness," the Negu muttered to himself, cupping the nose in hands he held as if reverentially offering flowers or incense before the Buddha. When he woke early as usual the next morning, the Negu found that the temple's ginkgo and horse chestnut trees had dropped their leaves overnight, spreading a bright, golden carpet over the temple grounds. And perhaps because of the frost on the roof of the pagoda, the 9-ring spire atop it flashed in the still faint glimmer of the rising sun. Standing on the veranda where the latticed shutters had been raised, Zenkai Negu took a deep breath of morning air. It was at this moment that an all but forgotten sensation returned to him. The Negu shot his hand up to his nose, but what he felt there was not the short nose he had touched in the night. It was the same old long nose he had always had, dangling down a good 6 inches from above his upper lip to below his chin. In the space of a single night, his nose had grown as long as ever. When he realized this, the Negu felt that same bright sense of relief he had experienced when his nose became short. Now no one will laugh at me anymore, the Negu whispered silently in his heart, letting his long nose sway in the dawn's autumn wind. January 1916. The end. As you immerse yourself in this narrative, you'll find that the nose brilliantly blends humor, absurdity, and incisive social commentary. Through its playful and bizarre narrative, the story invites readers to contemplate a range of themes. 1. Identity and the fluid self. The nose challenges conventional notions of identity, prompting readers to reflect on the fluid nature of selfhood. 2. Satire of societal norms. Through absurdity and satire, the narrative humorously critiques societal propriety and conventionality. 3. The absurdity of everyday life. The nose revels in the absurdity of daily existence, encouraging readers to see humor in the ordinary. 4. Humor as a vehicle for social commentary. The story uses wit and satire to dissect societal values and behaviors, sparking reflection and questioning. 5. Exploring the human condition. The narrative offers insights into the human tendency to conform to societal expectations and the consequences of deviating from the norm. 6. Embracing life's unpredictability. By highlighting life's capricious nature, the story encourages readers to embrace its inherent unpredictability. 7. Blurring reality and fantasy. The boundaries between reality and fantasy are blurred, prompting consideration of perception's malleability. 8. Symbolism of the nose. The detached nose symbolizes conformity and social expectations, emphasizing the absurdity of adhering to societal norms. 9. Subversion of authority. The story reverses roles, demonstrating that challenging authority can disrupt the status quo. 10. Surrealism and absurdity. The nose is associated with surrealism, challenging conventional narrative structures. In conclusion, The Nose by Ryunosuke Akutagawa is an enthralling and thought-provoking work that masterfully explores themes of identity, societal norms, the absurdity of everyday life, humor as a vehicle for social commentary, the human condition, life's unpredictability, and the interplay between reality and fantasy. It continues to captivate and challenge readers with its satirical and humorous portrayal of human existence. Thank you for listening.